Explosions rattled the hangar doors as Lieutenant Jack Ramsey sprinted across the frostbitten tarmac of RAF Thornfield in northern England, his breath freezing in clouds with every desperate step. Ahead, the newest fighter of the American squadron gleamed under the pale winter sun, its bulky silhouette casting a shadow that seemed to mock everything Jack had ever believed about aerial combat. The Republic XP-52. Hurricane Hawk, a monstrous machine that looked more like a flying tank than a nimble fighter, sat like a gargantuan metal beast, its barrel-shaped fuselage and massive radial engine dominating the runway. Jack's squadron mates, veterans of dogfights over the channel in sleek Hawker Hurricanes, muttered curses and shook their heads. They had seen elegant, deadly planes dance across the sky, weaving around enemy Messerschmitts like ribbons in the wind. This was something else. Over 8 tons fully loaded, nearly 3 times heavier than the nimble Zeros they had heard stories about in the Pacific, and with a wingspan that swallowed the tarmac beneath it, the Hurricane Hawk seemed doomed before it ever left the ground. British pilots had joked darkly that a pilot could hide inside the fuselage during a Luftwaffe attack, and in that moment, Jack could almost believe it. Half a world away, on the humid airfield of Port Moresby, New Guinea, Lieutenant Colonel Sam Whitaker, a grizzled 32-year-old Texan, stared at the same model with eyes alight with a mixture of fire and fascination. Where others saw a lumbering giant, he saw an engine of raw power, a sky-born juggernaut capable of turning the rules of combat on their head. Sam's heart raced at the possibilities, every detail of the Hurricane Hawk sparking strategies in his mind that no lighter, more fragile fighter could hope to achieve. Critics had already lined up before the first prototype had even flown. Too heavy to climb fast, too cumbersome to dogfight, a death trap for anyone daring enough to trust it. But Sam felt a surge of defiance. He would show them. He would make them eat their words. The skepticism was almost unanimous. Experienced pilots, hardened in the dogfights of the early war, had pored over the Hurricane Hawk's specs and shook their heads with grim resignation. "It's a flying coffin," muttered Captain Hugo Leonard, a veteran who had tangled with Luftwaffe aces over France. "You try to turn in one of those, you won't get out alive." Even German ace Klaus Reinhardt, later credited with over 100 victories, confirmed the weakness. The heavy radial engine, the massive fuselage, the awkward climb. These were vulnerabilities a skilled enemy could exploit mercilessly. Yet, as Jack approached the cockpit, hand hovering over the canopy latch, and Sam sketched attack patterns in his mind thousands of miles away, one thought burned through the fear and doubt. Maybe the rules were about to change. Lieutenant Klaus Reinhardt's cold, calculating assessment seemed to confirm every fear the American pilots had. Their new Hurricane Hawk was already understood by the enemy before it had even faced real combat. Even the aircraft's creator, a brilliant immigrant engineer from Georgia named Dmitry Kovalenko, met the criticism with a grim, wry smile. "Yes, it looks like a prehistoric monster," he told a visiting journalist, "but even a dinosaur can bite if it has the right proportions." The numbers on paper were intimidating. The XP-52D rolled out at 11,000 pounds empty, and once fully armed with fuel, bombs, and external tanks, it could tip the scales beyond 18,000 pounds, making it the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, heavier even than many twin-engine aircraft. Its wing loading of 46 pounds per square foot promised wide, lumbering turns and high stall speeds at lower altitudes. Pilots trained to dance through the skies with lightweight fighters shuddered at the thought of getting tangled with this leviathan. The skepticism was understandable, but physics on paper did not always predict victory in the air. Across the Pacific, American pilots had learned this bitter truth firsthand. Japanese aircraft, epitomized by the A-6M Thunder crane, embodied the opposite philosophy. Featherlight frames, tiny engines by comparison, and incredible agility. At 5,500 pounds fully loaded, the Thunder crane produced barely 950 horsepower, less than half of the Hurricane Hawk. but it could twist and turn with lethal precision. A skilled Japanese pilot could execute a half roll at over 230 miles per hour in under 6 seconds, leaving even the fastest Allied fighters straining to keep up. Test pilot Commander Henry Shaw, a seasoned veteran of naval aviation, flew captured Japanese planes to understand exactly what made them so terrifying. He concluded that the Thunder Crane was among the deadliest machines of the early war, light, nimble, and unforgiving. Its perfection in turning and climbing came at a steep cost. No armor for the pilot, no self-sealing tanks, a frame so fragile that a single burst of .50 caliber fire could shred it. In a straight fight, it was a marvel. In a firefight, it was a coffin waiting for the unlucky. Even more extreme was the Nakajima Ki 44 Swift Hawk, known to Allied pilots as the Sparrow. Smaller, lighter, and even more acrobatic than the Thunder Crane, it boasted unique combat flaps that allowed unbelievably tight turns, outmatching nearly every Allied plane at low altitudes. Japanese Army aviators in the early campaigns of Burma and the Philippines racked up kills with terrifying efficiency, exploiting every ounce of their aircraft's agility and the advantage of combat experience stretching back to China in the late 1930s. American pilots, fresh from stateside flight schools, found themselves crushed by both the planes and the men who flew them. In the jungles and airfields of New Guinea, entire squadrons were decimated in defensive battles, aircraft lost at rates of 2 to 1 or worse. Every dogfight revealed the same brutal pattern. Speed and maneuverability were not just advantages, they were survival. The psychological toll on young American flyers was immense. Confidence, often their most critical weapon, was shattered by the memory of aircraft spiraling into the ground under precise, lethal fire from an enemy who seemed to anticipate every move. Yet even in these dark months, Kovalenko's words lingered in the minds of a few daring pilots. A dinosaur can bite. Somewhere in the weight, the power, and the sheer endurance of the Hurricane Hawk, a chance remained to turn the tables. And men like Sam Whitaker were determined to find it. Survivors of the early Pacific engagements often spoke of a crushing helplessness, staring through their windshields at enemy fighters that seemed to anticipate every instinct and maneuver. Confidence earned in American flight schools evaporated in an instant when their aircraft, fast on paper but fragile in reality, failed them in combat. Squadrons stationed across the islands watched morale collapse as loss after loss mounted like a tide they could not stop. The problem was not courage, it was doctrine. American pilots had been trained for the classic dogfight, a swirling ballet of tight turns and acrobatics that had dominated the skies since 1914. Against the nimble Japanese Storm Crane and Falcon fighters, this approach was suicidal. Those who attempted to match the enemy turn for turn rarely survived. Only the few who adapted lived to fly another day. The breakthrough came with Lieutenant Commander Henry Prescott, a Navy pilot stationed at Pearl Harbor, who developed what would become known as the Prescott Weave in the winter of 1941. Late nights found him bent over a tabletop, moving wooden markers like tiny aircraft, studying patterns and possibilities. His insight was devastatingly simple. Never engage Zeros or Falcons in a turning fight. Instead, pilots should fly in pairs, covering each other while forcing the enemy into engagements where American aircraft excelled. Dives, high-speed passes, and attacks that exploited the enemy's mechanical limits. At the Battle of Coral Bay in June 1942, Prescott's tactics were put to the test. 4 Wildcat fighters, outnumbered by a dozen enemy aircraft, used his weaving techniques to devastating effect. Every maneuver was precise, every pair covering the other, and the enemy found itself denied the close-in fights it thrived upon. Dive attacks, disciplined high-speed engagements, and exploitation of the enemy's stiffening controls above 220 miles per hour became the pillars of what would soon be a tactical revolution. Into this evolving doctrine came the Hurricane Hawk, and into the Pacific came Lieutenant Colonel Sam Whitaker, a man who would transform the monster aircraft into a weapon perfectly suited to this new style of combat. Born June 12, 1911, in Amarillo, Texas, to Dr. Lawrence Whitaker and Clara Bell Morgan Whitaker, Sam spent his youth chasing wind and sky, moving with his family to Fort Worth at age 12. He graduated from Fort Worth High School in 1929, spent 2 years at Texas State Agricultural College, then worked in Dallas before enrolling at the University of Texas at Austin in 1934 to study commerce. By 1937, he completed his degree and enlisted in the Army Air Corps the following February, quickly earning his commission and wings after rigorous training at Brooks and Kelly Fields in Texas. Whitaker's early career took him across the United States. He flew with the 88th and 42nd Pursuit Squadrons at Selfridge Field in Michigan, mastering P-36 Hawks and early experimental fighters, then commanded the 17th Pursuit Squadron in the Panama Canal Zone from late 1940 to mid-1942. There, piloting P-39 Cobras in tropical heat, he gained extensive combat experience that would later define his approach to the P-47. Off-duty, he built a family life with his wife, Margaret Maggie Lane, and their 3 boys, Thomas, Samuel, and Henry, grounding himself amid the chaos of war. In October 1942, the Army Air Forces selected Whitaker to command the newly formed 352nd Fighter Group, armed with the massive Hurricane Hawk. Activated at Langley Airfield in Virginia, the group moved quickly across training bases in New York and Massachusetts before heading into the Pacific Theater. Where most pilots viewed the aircraft as cumbersome, even dangerous, Whitaker's eyes saw opportunity. To him, every pound of armor, every ounce of fuel, every massive engine meant power, endurance, and a potential game-changer in the skies. At 32, Whitaker was considered old for a combat fighter pilot in an Air Force dominated by men barely out of their teens. Yet he carried something far more valuable than youth: experience forged in years of diverse flying, and an analytical mind capable of seeing beyond conventional tactics. Where critics saw lumbering weight and poor maneuverability, Whitaker saw opportunity. The others were still thinking in terms of aerial combat as it had existed for a quarter century. Whitaker was thinking about war in the skies as it would be fought tomorrow. His insight was elegantly simple, yet demanded absolute discipline. The Hurricane Hawk was never built to dogfight. Trying to turn inside a Japanese Falcon in a Hurricane Hawk was like trying to outrun a Jaguar on foot. You would always lose. But you did not have to outrun the Jaguar if you struck from above, delivering punishment before the enemy could react. Whitaker devised systematic tactics that transformed the aircraft's weaknesses into lethal advantages. The guiding principle was clear: never lose speed or altitude. Every engagement began with the Hurricane Hawk perched at high altitude, ideally between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, where its turbocharged Pratt & Whitney radial engine gave it a performance edge over every opponent. Upon spotting enemy fighters below, the Hawks would dive at staggering speeds, well over 425 miles per hour, unleashing a storm of .50 caliber bullets from 8 Browning machine guns before using their momentum to climb back to altitude. Turning fights were forbidden. Energy and speed were life. The physics were brutally simple. At low altitude, the Japanese Falcons and Sparrows could outturn any American fighter. But above 30,000 feet, the thin air leveled the playing field. The Hurricane Hawk became surprisingly responsive, and in a dive, it was untouchable. Its enormous weight allowed it to accelerate beyond what lighter aircraft could tolerate, and a pursuing enemy would find stiffening controls and the limits of their airframe tested in moments. Each diving pass was a potential kill run, its concentrated firepower capable of ripping fragile Japanese fighters apart in mere seconds. Whitaker's Hawks carried a staggering arsenal: 8 Browning M2s, firing up to 100 rounds per second combined, with 3,400 rounds in total. A single 2-second burst could obliterate the light, delicate airframes of any Japanese aircraft, while the P-47's ruggedness ensured that if something went wrong, the pilot could survive. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine an 18-cylinder radial delivering up to 2,300 horsepower with water injection, could absorb multiple hits and keep running. Unlike liquid-cooled Spitfires or Messerschmitts, a Hurricane Hawk could return home with cylinders shredded, control surfaces torn, and holes in the fuselage large enough to see through. Every element of the design prioritized pilot survival. Reinforced control cables, armor plating around the cockpit and engine, structural members built to withstand punishment, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a rear-mounted turbocharger shielding the engine from attacks, all combined to make the Hurricane Hawk one of the toughest fighters in the world. This survivability would prove decisive in the grinding battles of the Pacific, where attrition could turn the tide. Pilots who survived those first harrowing missions returned stronger, more confident, and deadlier with each sortie. The Hurricane Hawk was no longer a monster. Under Whitaker's guidance, it became a predator. An aircraft that kept its pilots alive during the deadly baptism of fire meant more seasoned flyers returning to the squadron, and every veteran brought sharper skill and deadly efficiency to the next engagement. The 352nd Fighter Group consisted of the 355th, 356th, and 357th Fighter Squadrons, and under Whitaker's relentless guidance, they honed the high-altitude diving tactics that would define their combat doctrine. Training was brutal and unrelenting. Simulations mimicked real dogfights, and any pilot who instinctively dipped into turning battles was corrected immediately, sometimes harshly. Those who could not master the discipline were reassigned before deployment. By the time the group boarded the Army transport SS Theodore Franklin on May 20, 1943, every pilot knew the rules of engagement by heart. The squadron expected to fly missions over Europe, where Hurricanes and Thunderbolts were already clashing with the Luftwaffe. But as the ship passed through the Panama Canal and headed southwest into the Pacific, the truth became clear. The war they were about to enter would be unlike any they had trained for. The Pacific demanded long-range fighters capable of patrolling vast distances and striking at fortified enemy bases, a daunting challenge for the bulky Hurricane Hawk. Its internal fuel barely supported defensive sorties, let alone long-range sweeps. Whitaker reported for duty with the 7th Air Force in Brisbane, Australia, on June 25, 1943. 3 days later, the 352nd arrived at Milne Bay, New Guinea, becoming the first Hurricane Hawk unit in the Pacific Theater. Almost immediately, the pilots encountered the challenge everyone had predicted: range. Missions to enemy strongholds were impossible with standard internal fuel alone. Engineers worked feverishly to create a solution, producing 200-gallon belly tanks with booster pumps that extended combat radius dramatically. Crude by peacetime standards, but more than adequate for war, these modifications finally put the 352nd within striking distance of Japanese bases. Their first combat mission came on August 20, 1943. Captain Ray Harper and Lieutenant Samuel Kane scored the group's first kills, downing 3 Falcons over Rabaul. Triumph was bittersweet. Kane's aircraft took return fire, and he went down. The group's first combat casualty losses were unavoidable, but the lessons were immediate and unforgettable. The pilots rapidly internalized Whitaker's high-altitude tactics: dive from above, unleash devastating firepower, then climb away before the enemy could respond. Japanese pilots, who had terrorized Allied aviators for over a year, were stunned. They could neither catch nor escape the imposing Thunderbolts. From 25,000 feet, the Hawks struck like lightning, disappearing as quickly as they came. Within 4 months, the 352nd had claimed more than 160 confirmed kills, while losing just 9 pilots in combat. The record stunned veteran officers and demanded an explanation. The aircraft critics had called clumsy, too heavy, and too slow was achieving kill ratios rivaling the most elite units in any theater of a war. Whitaker's vision had turned what seemed to be a liability into a weapon of unprecedented lethality. The combination of disciplined pilots, lethal firepower, and the Hurricane Hawk's unique performance created a perfect storm that no nimble Japanese fighter could survive. And in the skies over New Guinea, A legend was beginning to form, not just of an aircraft, but of the pilots who had mastered it. General Thomas Wainwright, commanding the 7th Air Force, later recalled his first encounter with Whitaker. Within minutes of meeting the Texan, Wainwright said he wanted to know who had the highest confirmed kills in the theater. It wasn't idle curiosity. It was as if Whitaker had a quiet, unshakable drive to prove himself, to measure himself against every opponent. Wainwright recognized a spark beyond mere flying skill, an absolute certainty that Whitaker would rise above skepticism, doubt, and danger to become the deadliest pilot in the Pacific. Encouraging rivalry between Whitaker, ace Richard Sterling, and Thomas "Red" Caldwell, the general knew that men with this kind of relentless competitiveness would push limits others dared not approach. On the morning of November 7, 1943, Whitaker volunteered to lead a 4-plane sweep over Japanese airfields at Wewak Ridge, New Guinea. Wewak was a fortress in the sky. Multiple runways, heavy anti-aircraft emplacements, and squadrons of seasoned Japanese fighters poised to intercept any intruder. It was the perfect proving ground for Whitaker's tactics. His flight included Captain Leonard Hayes as his wingman, Major Philip Carr commanding the 357th Squadron as element leader, and Captain Daniel Price flying as Carr's wingman. 4 Hurricane Hawks against whatever the Japanese could muster. They took off at 9:45 from Milne Bay, climbing steadily to 28,000 feet, cruising in the thin upper air where the massive fighters excelled. The morning over New Guinea was a crystal-clear sapphire, with visibility stretching for miles, ideal conditions for high-speed diving strikes. At 11:20, Whitaker spotted a lone enemy fighter roughly 6,000 feet below. Post-war records would later identify it as probably Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Matsuda, commander of the Japanese 12th Fighter Group and one of the most seasoned aces in the theater. Diving from the sun, Whitaker's Hurricane Hawk screamed through the sky, its massive radial engine pushing the aircraft beyond 420 miles per hour. At 300 yards, he unleashed a controlled, devastating burst from all 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns. Flames engulfed the enemy aircraft, spiraling it earthward. A single kill on a mission that had been intended as simple reconnaissance. But the mission was far from over. Minutes later, the flight spotted a formation that would test every principle Whitaker had drilled into his men. 12 bombers cruising at 5,000 feet. Protected by 36 fighters weaving above them like a living shield. The Hurricane Hawks were outnumbered at least 12-1, all alert, fully armed, and battle-ready. The reconnaissance objective was already complete. Fuel was running low. Standard procedure dictated reporting the formation and returning to base. Any reasonable pilot would have done exactly that. Whitaker gave the signal to engage. What followed in the next 10 minutes would prove the deadly effectiveness of his tactics when executed with flawless precision. From 28,000 feet, the 4 Hurricane Hawks became streaks of thunder, diving through the enemy formation with terrifying speed. Japanese pilots found themselves unable to respond. The Hawks struck from above, unleashed devastating firepower, and then climbed back to safety before the enemy could react. Every maneuver Whitaker had drilled, the high-altitude advantage, the dive attacks, the disciplined avoidance of turning fights, worked exactly as designed. By the end of the engagement, 2 bombers were downed, 5 enemy fighters destroyed, and the Hurricane Hawks returned to base largely unscathed. For the men of the 352nd Fighter Group, it was a revelation. The aircraft, once dismissed as cumbersome and unwieldy, had become an instrument of calculated terror. The rules of air combat in the Pacific had changed, and Whitaker had rewritten them with speed, firepower, and relentless tactical precision. Leading the dive at over 425 miles per hour, Whitaker tore through the enemy formation like a predator unleashed. In rapid succession, he shot down 3 Japanese fighters on his first pass, the enemy scattering in panic as the 4 Hurricane Hawks ripped through them with terrifying precision. Pulling up into a zoom climb, Whitaker spotted his wingman, Captain Hayes, pursued by 2 fighters closing fast. Without hesitation, he rolled his massive aircraft over and plunged back into the fray, tearing both attackers apart with deadly accuracy. saving Hayes in a display of skill that seemed almost superhuman. Even with 5 confirmed kills already, Whitaker pressed the attack, diving once more through the fractured enemy formation. Only when ammunition ran critically low and enemy fighters were converging from multiple directions did he signal his flight to break off, slipping into cloud cover and guiding the group back toward friendly airspace. Their Hurricane Hawks touched down at Milne Bay with barely 50 gallons of fuel remaining, engines groaning from the extreme exertion. They had pushed themselves and their aircraft to the very edge of possibility. The tally was staggering. Whitaker claimed 6 confirmed kills, with a 7th probable that went unverified when his gun camera jammed. Captain Price scored 1 victory, Captain Hayes 2, and Major Carr, separated during the chaotic engagement, landed safely. 9 Japanese aircraft destroyed, including what was likely a senior enemy commander, without a single American loss. Back at Milne Bay, the pilots celebrated with victory rolls over the field. Price executed 1, Hayes 2, and Whitaker, counting each confirmed and probable kill, rolled 7 times, a defiant statement of triumph and precision. Lieutenant Frederick Vaughn, the 357th Squadron's intelligence officer, could barely contain his astonishment as he wrote in the after-action report. A total of 9 enemy fighters destroyed without a scratch on a single Hurricane Hawk demonstrates that this aircraft has arrived. Its staggering speed in dives and straight runs, rapid aileron rolls, and concentrated firepower will henceforth strike fear into the hearts of the enemy. The official citation for the Distinguished Service Cross would later describe the action in measured military language. Colonel Whitaker voluntarily led a flight of 4 fighters to reconnoiter heavily defended enemy airfields near Wewak. After observing enemy installations and intercepting aircraft formations, he identified a lone enemy fighter below. Diving from superior altitude, he destroyed multiple enemy aircraft while maintaining the initiative and safeguarding his flight, securing vital intelligence and delivering a decisive blow to enemy air power. That day marked the moment the Hurricane Hawk earned its reputation in the Pacific. Where critics had seen lumbering weight and vulnerability, Whitaker and his pilots revealed a machine of unparalleled power, precision, and survivability. The legend of the aircraft, and the men who mastered it, was no longer a promise. It was a reality written in fire across the skies of New Guinea.